Yes.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this month's webinar. We're doing an intro on navigating AI risks, and so I'll briefly go over the agenda. For those that don't know me, I'm Katie Ruckel. I'm the state's Chief Privacy Officer and at the Office of Privacy and Data Protection. So today we're going to do an intro for public sector AI use from Cheney Curry, and she'll introduce herself when she joins or when it's her turn to speak. And then Matt will turn it over back to me to talk about responsible AI principles. And then Matt's going to get into a lot of the risk guidance pieces that he has worked hard on developing for the state. So I'm excited for today's webinar. As Rhonda stated, today's webinar will be recorded and posted online, and then the slide deck will be sent to all participants as well as posted online as well. So we'll go ahead and get started with Cheney. Please introduce yourself and welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Cheney Curry. I work here at WATEC as the Enterprise AI Business Architect, and I'm here to just ground us in what AI is at a very high level and how we see it being used across the state. So next slide, please. So what is AI? AI is a very broad technological field that aims to emulate human intelligence, including how we perceive the world, how we make decisions and predict outcomes. AI, the term, is the umbrella under which many different technologies fall. So in this example, we're going to break that down using generative AI as our anchor. So within AI, we have something called machine learning, and machine learning uses algorithms to analyze data, learn from it, and provide insights, predictions, decisions, etc. A subset of machine learning is called deep learning. Deep learning involves training neural networks, which are very similar to neurons in the brain. They're interconnected nodes that connect information together. And in deep learning, there are several layers and very complex connections that can happen between these large data sets. So deep learning really takes all of that data and all those connections and starts to make sense of them. And then at the very end, we culminate with what all of that comes out to present, which is generative AI. And generative AI takes all of this analysis and patterns and creates new content based on prompts that we feed it. So it uses something called a large language model that helps it train itself on large data sets. And as we interact with the AI, it learns from our prompts and our feedback and our inputs to make those responses even better. So all coming together, I would kind of like to liken artificial intelligence as a human brain. It's kind of modeled that way, and it's just a way of making sense of a lot of very deep and complex data sets. Next slide. So this shows up in a lot of different ways in our world, but in state government, there are some ways that this is starting to show up a lot more commonly, and I wanted to cover those today. The first one we just talked about was generative AI, so this is probably the piece that folks are most familiar with. This is when AI creates new content that's prompted by the user, and it learns from that data to generate more targeted content over time. So the most classic example here is ChatGPT. I think most of us have probably tried to use that at one point, where you put in a prompt and it provides new content based on that prompt. The next one is it's a term that is starting to become more and more prevalent in the industry, and that's called agentic AI. So these are AI agents that are designed to perform tasks in the service of human goals without direct human intervention. So the most common example of this would be chatbots. So you go onto a website and you get a little chatbot ping at you, and you can ask it a question and it'll provide you with a response. There is no human in that loop. So this is a very brief and like low risk way of introducing AI to our end users. Computer vision is a more discrete way of using AI. So this is AI that is used to process, interpret, and provide insights into visual information. For example, DNR is currently running a project where they're using AI to do eelgrass scanning. So they're taking videos of eelgrass or underwater grasses, and they're using AI to tag those grasses based on a series of inputs. And as you can imagine, that's probably saving them quite a bit of time in the long run. And then the last common way, and is becoming more and more prevalent, is something called natural language processing. So natural language processing is actually used in most circumstances of AI because it is the way AI presents information back to us in a way that we can understand instead of it being just a bunch of zeros and ones. But in a more direct application, we are seeing this used most commonly in language translation tools. So something like Google Translate uses natural language processing to translate information from one language to another. Next slide. So within our technology, what we have done internally was kind of bucket them into three big buckets of the way AI is commonly showing up technology-wise. The first is really intentional AI. So those are the solutions that we are acquiring specifically for their AI capabilities. So again, ChatGPT is a perfect example. It is a generative AI tool, and that is what it is there to do, and that's why you use it. Incidental AI. So this is new or existing solutions that have generative or any AI embedded within them, but it might not be their primary purpose. So a good example of this one is over the past few years, Adobe has been embedding more and more AI into their products. I think that's most evident in Photoshop. If you're a Photoshop user, that's become like quite a big thing in that tool. So that's an example of an existing solution you might have that starts to bring AI into it. And finally, we have third-party AI. So these are solutions that are used by entities that might interact with us, but are not part of Washington state government. So primary example here would be if we have a customer coming in to use our services that doesn't speak English or speaks very limited English, they would use something potentially like Google Translate to help them automatically translate and interact with us. That's an example of them using a tool to facilitate communication with us that we aren't really responsible for. Next slide. So why use AI in the first place? Like, what is its purpose? So there's actually a lot of really large benefits to AI. Related to that language piece, customer service really benefits from AI because it can help us facilitate access to information in near real time, regardless of language preference, regardless of availability of our call center staff. Folks can engage with chatbots using their language of choice and get information very quickly. Um, it increases our industry compliance. So if you have ever worked in a regulatory agency or you do now, you know that sometimes there are challenges with folks understanding the state laws and regulations that they're beholden to. And we can use AI to help plain talk some of that information better and help people become more compliant with our requirements. Enabling the workforce through automation. So we can augment common tasks that take a lot of time, like meeting transcription, summarizing documents, or in the previous example, scanning eelgrass and categorizing it. We can use AI to do that work for us and thereby freeing up our staff to do that complex work. So now, instead of having to sit in front of a computer and manually identify eelgrass, now we can have our staff actually take that data and do something important with it. And then finally, my hope is that this will help us start to modernize our own technologies. So one of the things that is really cool about AI is it's very good at analyzing code. So you can potentially use AI to translate legacy coding languages into modern versions, review and test code that you've developed, and my favorite, generate reference guides. So if you've worked in like disaster recovery in any form or fashion, there is an expectation that we have good information about the applications we're supporting. So in the event a disaster occurs, you can spin up your mission critical services immediately. Unfortunately, a lot of times that stuff gets deprioritized because we just don't have time to do it. So if we can start to use AI to generate that work for us, we can be much better prepared in the future if something were to happen. Next slide. All right, so these are the common challenges we're starting to see. I'm not going to go into the bullet points. Those are just guidance on what you could do to address these challenges, but I'll just kind of explain what they are. So the first one is content accuracy. So as we know, especially in generative AI, AI can create content that is based on hallucinated, biased, or inaccurate information. And without any kind of intervention, there is a risk of state agencies conveying incorrect and potentially harmful information to the public. So that's definitely something to keep an eye out on. Staff adoption. So staff, there is a lot of fear out there on what AI is and how it might impact work. So staff might not naturally adopt it. We need to make sure that our staff are receiving training not only on how to use it responsibly, but in a way that's increasing their level of comfort and confidence around the technology itself. Customer adoption. So customers might not be quick to adopt AI, especially when working with government services. They might not trust that the information it's conveying to them is accurate, and they might not trust that the information they're providing an AI service is actually getting back to us. So there's some change management we can do there as well. And finally, data maturity. So this is probably the biggest barrier we've started to encounter is that successful adoption of AI truly relies on having mature, high quality data sets and a strong data management practice. That old adage of bad data in, bad data out is fully present in AI. It is one of the truest statements you can have there. So what we're noticing is oftentimes agencies will want to do something AI related, and then that becomes a big barrier for them to do it successfully. And outside of that, there are several other challenges around financial and human resource costs, unclear return on investment, and other issues. But these are the big ones we're seeing today. So, with that brief introduction, I will turn it over to Katie. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheney. So I'm just going to briefly touch on the responsible AI principles because we want to remind everybody that this is what the state is adopting. So these are the AI principles based from the NIST risk management framework. These are interim guidelines on the use of generative AI. And we had a early presentation and webinar that dives deeper into each one of these principles. And so I'm not going to spend too much time today going through them, but I do want to highlight the very last one, the public purpose and social benefit. So that one is not actually presently in the NIST AI risk management framework principles because that is intended, I think, to be focused for industry as well as government. But in the state of Washington, we thought that this was an important principle that we wanted to be encompassed in how the state adopts AI, which really gets to that the use of AI should support the state's work in delivering better and more equitable services and outcomes to its residents. And so the next slide is just another depiction from NIST on all of the principles. The piece that I wanted to highlight for everybody's awareness is that the NIST AI risk management framework, artificial intelligence trustworthiness principles are what the AI task force that's led by the Attorney General's office is considering to recommend for adoption in the state more broadly. And so we also anticipate incorporating these principles into the enterprise AI policy, and that's part of the draft right now that's being reviewed. So without much more to say about that, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Cheney. For anybody that doesn't know me, my name is Matt King. I'm a privacy and data protection manager in the State Office of Privacy and Data Protection at WATEC. And I'm going to be walking you all through the rest of the webinar this morning, which really starts getting into kind of the nuts and bolts of what we've done so far along the lines of risk assessment, some basic considerations, and laying the groundwork for the types of AI risks to be on the lookout for, and then also walk through some actual steps that have been operationalized as part of our enterprise review process. So the first thing is just to call out that there was an executive order issued at the beginning of 2024 that required quite a bit of work from several agencies, including WATEC, the Department of Enterprise Services, the Office of Financial Management, and the Office of Equity around things like public sector use that Cheney was very involved in, and procurement and contract terms and a training plan. But one of the deliverables was specifically to produce guidance on risk assessments for what the order called high-risk generative AI systems, and I'll go into more detail about what that means later on this morning. But the main thing to call out here is that a lot of this is spelled out in executive order. The order talks about the types of things that should be included in these types of risk assessments, and I'm not going to go through and read these for you here, but you will have the slide deck later, and you'll start to see these in some of the sort of shadows of this in the other slide about this morning, that these are kind of incorporated throughout this work. So based on this requirement, we did develop this report called Implementing Risk Assessments for High-Risk AI Systems that talks about some of the basics about AI risks, and also goes into much more depth about some of the challenges in identifying and assessing risks, especially in the public sector. So that is available as a resource out there for folks who want to go into more detail, but we're also bringing you other resources like this webinar to walk you through the really important things to understand. So when we are talking about identifying high-risk use cases, one of the most challenging aspects of that is actually just identifying AI uses in the first place before you even think about assigning the risk level. Part of that goes to what Cheney was talking about with the idea of intentional AI. So when we're going out and getting these AI products because of that AI functionality they're offering, but we're often just experiencing incidental AI where it sort of just happens to the software that we are already using, or it happens to be a part of a new technology that we're procuring, but it's not the main reason we're getting it. And that isn't always super consistent with the way that we do security and other risk reviews of new technologies. So when we're talking about the kind of original functionality of these systems, so what I mean there is like the first time you go out and you get one of these tools, and we're talking about intentional AI, our existing processes are really well identify those use cases and then assess them. That's kind of the bread and butter for how these things were developed. But it starts getting a little trickier when we talk about the original functionality and incidental AI, because we're not always reviewing all the other things that this technology does if it's not the primary reason we're getting it. So we still have our current processes are still pretty well situated to identify those incidental AI uses, and we can use them, but we need to make sure that we're being thoughtful about this and thinking more expansively about how those technologies may be incorporated, and also working to update processes and templates to make sure we're explicitly capturing that information, asking questions about what type of AI may be involved. And so that's something that we're working on at the enterprise level to modify those processes and templates, and also something that we encourage agencies to undertake at their level too. Then it gets even a little bit squirrelier when we talk about changes to capability or use. So under our existing review processes, there are requirements when there are substantial changes that projects or systems go back through the review process. But we know that this can be applied a little bit inconsistently, and it can be hard to actually identify those cases. So when we're talking again about the intentional types of AI, we can still use our existing processes, but we do need to make sure we're doing some kind of periodic review, and that we're training folks to make sure that we are aware of the potential for new AI to be introduced into existing products, and that we're capturing those. The same is true for changes over time that are just for incidental AI. And this is where I think we potentially have the biggest blind spot. And in addition to doing training and periodic review, this is somewhere where we need to make sure that we're incorporating contract terms that can help identify these types of uses. One of the deliverables that I mentioned under the executive order was model contract terms from the Department of Enterprise Services, and that's available out there on the DES website, and it does include some examples of terms to help capture these uses and put it on to your vendors to proactively notify you before they launch new AI in your existing systems. Go on to talk a little bit about the specific risks presented by AI, and even more specifically from generative AI. But things I should say, that aren't necessarily intuitive right away about AI if you understand these considerations, it can help you think about AI risks in the future. And one is that when we review new technology, sometimes we focus just on what are the kind of net new risks, and we ignore the things that get worse over time or are exacerbated by the new technology. So there are definitely some types of risks posed by Gen AI that are new from other types of technology that we have. But a lot of the times it's actually posing similar risks, but magnifying them, so exacerbating them. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But I've definitely been in many conversations where, people have a tendency to say, well, that is an existing risk with what we have now. Why is it any different with AI? And there are a couple of things about that. One is, the fact that we have an existing risk doesn't mean that it's not something that we should address when we have new products going forward. We should always be trying to identify and treat risks better. But the other thing is that these types of risks posed by AI can often change both even if there is a vulnerability that exists now, it can change the magnitude and the impact of what happens when something goes wrong, and can make it more likely to go wrong. And so you have both of those things combined, you're really talking about a fundamentally new type of risk to consider, even though the underlying cause may already exist today. Another characteristic of Gen AI risks is that with other types of technology, we often expect that as we get better at it and as there's advancement, that we also get the bugs out and the quirks out, and it's going to start being less risky. But because of the nature of the risks that are posed by Gen AI, which is often about increased capability, the risks don't necessarily go down over time as the technology improves. And in many cases, it actually grows as the technology improves. And then the last thing is just around Gen AI specifically, again, which is that these systems are designed to be creative. They're supposed to give an output that's similar but not the same to what they were trained on. So that creativity is a feature. They're supposed to be less predictable. So in many ways, that is a benefit. That's why we have created these systems. But it also means, in terms of being able to have repeatable, predictable outcomes, that it is a feature that they're going to be less predictable, and we should understand that as we think about what types of risks may exist and how we may build in safeguards to protect against them. So I'm going to walk through now about a dozen types of risks that are posed by Gen AI. Some of them you already heard Cheney talk about. I did not come up with these. These are from our friends at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which we rely on heavily in the cybersecurity area and in the privacy area with some of their frameworks. And they also, as Katie mentioned, have put out an AI risk management framework. And as part of that, they have another document called the Generative AI Profile, which more specifically talks about addressing Gen AI risks. And in that document is where they lay these out. So it's important to keep in mind that some of these will apply to state uses, but they will apply to differently to different types of actors. And they also have different kinds of harms. Like some of them will be societal harms, some could be group harms, like a subset of the overall population, and some are very individual focused harms. Um, and the last thing to keep in mind about these is that it is talking about the actual like manifested risk that actually occurs, the thing that actually happens, and not necessarily what is happening on the back end that causes the risks. So the first one, hopefully not super relevant to most state agencies and the types of things we're doing, but this is about chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons, or CBRN, which is basically the idea that there's lots of information out there already about these types of weapons, but AI has the capability that wouldn't otherwise have the expertise to do anything with that information to actually act on it and create weapons. Um, Confabulation is what we normally hear called hallucinations or fabrications. So this is just the idea of confidently saying things that are actually false. I think many of us have probably had the experience with ChatGPT or another large language model where you ask it a pretty basic question and it gives you an answer that seems likely incorrect, and you say, "Are you sure?" And it says, "Yes, I'm sure," and just doubles down on it. So that is definitely, unfortunately, one of the common features of generative AI. Um, Dangerous or violent recommendations is the next one. So these models are often trained on publicly available data created by humans, and unfortunately, that means that there is a lot of potentially harmful that's gotten into these models. So as a result, they can sometimes create content that is dangerous, or recommend things that are illegal or may cause self-harm. So I think a really concrete example of this would be if you had a teenager who was experiencing mental health issues and they went to a large language model to ask for help and received unhelpful responses back from the model. Data privacy, it only gets 3 lines here, but I sure there's a lot there that you'll hear Katie and I talk about in other webinars as well. But there's really quite a wide range of issues related to possible privacy issues. Um, uh, on one hand, there are issues about the use of personal models themselves, like how the models are trained. So there you get into things about like transparency. Did people know that their information is going into the model? Did they consent? Um, is the use of personal information in that model consistent with the original reason that the data was collected, which is our purpose limitation privacy principle? Um, and then you also have the ability to access, aside from the training data, you also have the ability to have privacy violations in operation. So these models that were used or that use personal information to be trained can then accidentally leak that personal information, sometimes with accurate information, sometimes with not quite accurate information, which can also be very harmful. And the models can also be used to aggregate lots of disparate sources of information and re-identify information that not that long ago we would have assumed was totally de-identified. Um, Environmental concerns are the next one. There is a huge energy impact both to create these models in the first place and then also to keep them operational. This is one that I know is top of mind for a lot of folks within the state. it's something that many of us care deeply about and are aware of. I will say it is one that is a little bit hard to measure at the system level because it's hard to figure out the actual environmental impact of a pretty discrete system that may not have wide use or a lot of users. And really, it's more when you zoom out that you start seeing the larger environmental impact from the cumulative effect of the technology. Um, Harmful bias and homogenization. So this is just the idea that these based on non-perfect data, and they have the ability to increase the speed and scale of biases. So this is definitely an example of one of those risks that exists today. It exists in how humans operate. It exists in existing data that we have, and it gets potentially exacerbated and magnified through the use of AI. Human AI configuration is about the way humans interact with systems. So in this case, we can misconfigure how these systems should work in the first place, or we can use them poorly. So the biggest example of that, and I think the most applicable for us in our professional lives, is the risk of automation bias, which is basically the idea of over-reliance on AI. So you may go into using AI for the first time, being really skeptical. You've read all this stuff about hallucinations, um, and then you start to use it and you find that it works, and you know that you're supposed to check the outputs every time, but over time, as you keep getting good results back, you get a little bit more lax, and eventually you're relying on the system in a way that is not intended to be used, and you're really giving it more autonomy than it should have. So this is something that definitely needs to be addressed with performance monitoring and also a lot of training and awareness around how to properly use these systems. Information integrity is about the ability to increase or the increased ability to create false or misleading content, especially at scale. So this is where we're talking about misinformation or disinformation that's both more believable than what we used to be able to create and can be created at a much greater scale now. In information security, we're talking about two big aspects again. One is around enabling new cybersecurity risks by lowering barriers. So this is similar to information integrity, where it allows attacks to be created more efficiently at scale from people who probably wouldn't have the expertise to do that in the past. Also makes those attacks in the case of things like phishing much more believable. Like the days of being able to just spot phishing emails through typos may be coming to an end here. And then it also expands the attack surface for information security vulnerabilities. So as we use more and more of these AI systems, you end up with a more complicated technology web that has a greater surface for people, for bad actors to capitalize on. Intellectual property, again, noticing a theme here is that a lot of these have two main aspects that they can come up. With intellectual property, one of the issues is about the idea of how these models were trained and whether there was appropriate permission and whether the models should have been allowed to use the material that they used to be trained in the first place, or whether that was protected and this use that's now baked into these models was allowed in the first place. And then on the user end, there are also questions about how you can protect things that you create through artificial intelligence. We have a robust intellectual property regime in the United States around copyrights and trademarks, and basically the way that you protect your ideas from being exploited by competitors. But the those systems are all based on the idea of human creations, and so there are questions being worked through in the courts around how much human involvement you need to actually be able to protect the outputs of generative AI. The next is obscene, degrading, and/or abusive content. So this is kind of like a more specific example of the information integrity risk, and this is specifically about creating obscene, normally fake information. Like deep fake pornography would be the obvious example of this, and then also child sexual abuse material. Well, this is an area where there's been a lot of active legislation around criminalizing the creation of this type of material, and it seems to be somewhere where regulation of AI has a lot of momentum and widespread agreement on the need to criminalize this type of behavior. And then the last one is value chain and component integration. So this is really about the idea that this is the integration of AI, especially all those incidental uses of AI, is really making the technology much more complicated to understand where things go wrong when they do go wrong, and figuring out where a risk may have happened within the whole integration of different systems that we have. So basically it just comes down to it can make it more difficult to attribute issues to the appropriate place and address those risks. These are just a couple other things that aren't explicitly listed in the NIST Gen AI profile, but are very relevant to how we assess AI systems and think about risks. One is around transparency. So a couple different ways this comes up. One is just that we tend to be programmed to think that we're interacting with humans. So we're getting more used to the fact, for example, that those chatbots that we're all talking to out on our bank's website or an airline's website are not in fact humans, but that's taken a little bit of getting used to, and I think that there's still some really unclear lines of exactly when we're interacting with humans and when we are instead having decisions that are being made about us by AI tools. There are also issues around interpretability and explainability, basically the idea of like how do these systems actually work. So interpretability is about transparency of the model itself, like sort of the inner workings of how it comes to particular outputs, like what that reasoning process is, how it's trained. And then explainability is more like the after the fact explanation. So not so much system specific, but more individual output specific, where we thinking about like providing specific resources or the specific reasoning to answer a question. So on the explainability side, I think we've seen a lot of progress with more recent tools. In showing the end user how these systems are working, but the interpretability is still somewhere where there are some pretty big gaps. And then data readiness is the last big one, and Cheney talked about this a little bit, but as she mentioned, there are really big considerations to make sure these systems operate efficiently and accurately. So data availability is the first one called out here, which is just you need to have the data for these things to work. They rely heavily on appropriate data. Inconsistent data is something that frequently comes up. So as an example, one common use case is wanting to train or to create a chatbot that's trained off of a set of laws or a set of guidebooks and references or internal policies, which can seem really simple and straightforward at first, but what you often find is that those policies or those laws actually aren't straightforward in the first place, right? They have inconsistencies, they have ambiguities, and the large language models aren't necessarily good at sorting through those systems. So it's not enough to just point AI at those documents. The documents themselves have to be accurate. Outdated data is another risk here. So an example of this would be like if you had a rural hospital that was sort of fine-tuned their model based on the population in the area. And then if the population changes over time and the model is still using the original training data, then you end up with drift in the model, and it may no longer be producing accurate outputs for that particular population that it's serving. And then the last one is mislabeled data. So an example here, I mean, the basic idea is like the data is not what the metadata says it is, which can create functionality problems. So the example would be if you're having AI getting access to data based on like existing tags or permissions, then if you're relying on those tags, then you're also relying on the accuracy of those labels as well. So with that understanding of the types of risks, we're going to talk about what the actual risk determination requirements are, both as laid out in the executive order and then also what we have been operationalizing at the enterprise level through WATEC's review processes. So we do have a definition of high-risk generative AI system that comes directly from the executive order, and it is a system using generative AI that creates a high risk to natural person's health and safety or fundamental rights. So it's really focused on risks to individual people. So that is really the minimum types of risks that we're going to categorize as high risk. But I do want to just at least take a slight pause to say we do also encourage agencies to consider other types of risks. So, for example, like you could have an AI risk of significant operational impacts to like a core system that could cause that core system to be non-operational over time in a way that doesn't impact humans at all, because that's not the purpose of the system. But if it's impacting the agency's overall operations, I think that we probably consider that high risk regardless of whether it actually impacts health or safety. So we encourage agencies to think about those types of things as well. So when we're thinking about whether a system creates a high risk, what we're specifically talking about, and this is very common to how other types of risks are assessed, is we're talking about the magnitude of the impact and the likelihood of that impact occurring. And when we're doing that, we're talking about both direct impacts, like when an AI system is used to determine eligibility for benefits, but we also want to think about indirect impacts, like when an AI system is used to allocate resources in a way that impacts the people in a particular community. So when we think about those indirect impacts, really any of those types of risks from the Gen AI profile could lead to a high risk to people's health, safety, or fundamental rights, even if it's not really a direct impact. So one example of that would be we have really strict privacy protections for sensitive health information about substance use and sexually transmitted infections. So if an AI system is used to allow unauthorized disclosure of that information or allow de-identified information to be re-identified, lead to real life impacts on housing and employment for those people. So just one example of a risk, a privacy violation that we wouldn't normally think about as directly impacting a person's health or safety, but when you zoom out, you start to see that it really could have those types of impacts. So this is the idea of the magnitude and likelihood, using those two axes to determine the overall impact. With the magnitude, it ranges from negligible to severe or catastrophic, with severe or catastrophic being a 5. And then with the likelihood, on the likelihood side, it ranges from remote or improbable being a 1, all the way up to probable being a 5. And as you're thinking about these numbers, you're not alone. We do have a resource out there published on our website now that walks through both the last couple of slides that you've seen here with how to measure this magnitude and likelihood, but also a couple of considerations to think about in assessing these types of risks. And they fall into three main categories. The first is the intended use in operating context. So here you're looking at things like the level of autonomy for the system. Is it something that you're just using as a resource to help you write something, or is it truly agentic, like Cheney was talking about, and operates without human intervention? You also think here about things like the legal background. Are you dealing with protected information? And directly considering who the people are that are expected to be impacted by the system. The next category is around the data characteristics. So is this confidential information that's going to have different implications and requirements for how it can be used? And also, will the system process personal information as specifically called out? If it does, it probably increases the likelihood of impacting people's health or safety. And then the last category is system characteristics and safeguards. So this is where you're looking at how has the system been constructed to actually minimize the risks that you've identified. So if you have known evidence of discrimination, as an example, that would be very relevant. You want to look at transparency and interpretability and explainability. And then also you can look at built-in filters and monitoring specifically around harmful outputs. And these are things that are often included in what are called AI model cards that the large language model providers make available to users. Once you have taken all of this information and done your due diligence, you're going to take your scores and you're going to plot it on this heat map and figure out if the risk is low, moderate, or high. So if it ends up being 1 to 2, we call that low risk. If it's 3 to 11, it ends up being a moderate risk, and anything that is a 12 or higher ends up being a high risk. And then the last piece of this is what you actually do with this risk level once you have it, which is the part that has been built into our existing security design review process. So when you go and submit a new security design review on the Office of Cybersecurity's submission form, there are new questions in there that specifically talk about whether the system uses artificial intelligence technologies. And one quick caveat here is please do not use these numbers, even though it says 11 and 12 here. The form has logic built into it, and so depending on which options you choose, unfortunately the numbers also may change. So pay attention to the questions, but don't just use shorthand of like, we need to answer question 11. These questions are, the first one is, does your deployment of the solution use AI technologies, which and also provides the definition of AI, which is on our WATEC definitions page. If you click no, you're going to be done, don't need to ask any or answer anything else about AI. If you click yes, the next question that's going to pop up is to ask what AI risk level your agency has assigned to this solution, and you're going to get the options of low, moderate, high, or undetermined. If you selected low, moderate, or high, you are going to be asked to enter the email address and identify the person who actually made the risk level determination. And that's just to make sure that there's a point person if there are questions about that, there needs to be follow-up that happens. If you instead selected, or I should say, with lower or moderate, that decision will be tracked, and there is a AI tracker available to people who are submitting the security design reviews. For high risk solutions, you will then be asked to complete a high-risk AI risk assessment, and that's a more in-depth tool that we'll be talking about in more detail the next in this series, or the next webinar in this series, I should say. If you clicked instead of low, moderate, or high, if you instead clicked undetermined, then you're instead going to have a question here that asks you to acknowledge that you will need to submit the AI risk level determination before the SDR will be completed. So you'll click I understand, and then you will have email automatically generated to the person who submitted the SDR that has a template form for you to complete and email back to ai@watech.wa.gov, which we'll then log, and you'll be able to have your SDR closed when the determination is submitted. The tool or the template itself that will be emailed to you is basically the same document that is available on the internet that walks through that heat map and how to measure the magnitude and likelihood of an AI risk occurring, and then also those kind of 3 categories of considerations that we just walked through. And the only thing that needs to be completed on it is the circled section, which is just your agency, the project name, what the risk level is, and again, identifying the person who made that risk level determination. And with that, I hope you all have a bit of a better understanding of considering AI risks and the specific steps needed to identify risk levels up through the point of identifying it as low, moderate, or high. And we look forward to seeing you next time, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming today. And Matt, thank you so much for all your work on this and all of the great information that you shared. We also included the link in the chat for where the website will be posted. And we'll go ahead and close recording now. And I think we have a couple of minutes left for questions.